When I was asked to come to one of my favorite buildings on earth and speak about one of the organizations I admire most in all the world, I'm kind of impulsive, like frequently to a disturbing degree, so of course I allowed my enthusiasms to override the information the calendar was vainly shrieking at me during my all too cursory perusal of it before saying yes, and I said yes, and here I am. At the start of the second week of previews of the first New York Revival of Angels in America, time during which every experience I've ever had in my 25 years of professional experience as a professional playwright has taught me, or at least ought to have taught me, I really shouldn't be allowed out in public. Not even restaurants and bars are particularly safe. A playwright whose play is in early previews is a hypocritical creature compounded of one part mother whose child was sent off to get a carton of milk at the corner grocery store and hasn't returned in 2 months, one part mid-level financial officer at Lehman Brothers in the late afternoon of September 14th, 2008, one part serial killer facing execution who can't focus on praying for forgiveness because perpetually distracted by the desire to murder a few more people before they pull the switch. You get the idea. So coming here and talking tonight seemed like a good idea at the time, but I'm a mess, so thank you all for coming and good night. No, just kidding. I mean, I'm not kidding. I'm not going to talk for very long. I wrote this afternoon while sitting in the dark in the theater while they fixed a light cue for Act 1, Scene 8 of Part 1, which, never mind. I love the New York Public Library. I've spent some of my happiest working hours here, and once, 177 years ago, I got picked up, and never mind. I love this place. I'll be terribly sad when our misbegotten budget cuts have forced it to close and it's turned into a Raymore and Flanagan's showroom. And when all its local branches have been sold off to Starbucks before Starbucks goes bankrupt, after which all the people who have become homeless because of triple-digit unemployment and subprime mortgage foreclosures can squat in the abandoned former branch libraries turned Starbucks. So you see, it'll all work out. And on the bright side, the Bush tax cuts for the super rich will have been saved because the GOP will take back the Congress, because progressive people aren't going to work for Democrats or vote in the midterms, because we want to express our disapproval of President Obama, because 2 whole years after taking over the executive branch of the US government from the holocaustally calamitous and criminal previous administration, all he's done is to pass over the Nuremberg-inflected objections of an increasingly manifestly mentally unbalanced opposition, the first real health care reform in 100 years, and force a right-wing Congress to start to seriously regulate the financial sector. There is, as I said, a bright side to this. The super rich will have garbage bags full of extra cash and will hopefully give buckets of it to the LGBT initiative at the New York Public Library and to GMHC. Like I said, I really shouldn't be out in public right now. I probably just offended at least 50 potential corporate sponsors and individual donors for this eminently worthy, immensely important, or these two eminently worthy and immensely important organizations, and I haven't even really said anything yet. And now they've finally fixed that light cue, so I won't really have time to write much more because I need to get back to annoying my cast and director. But before I do, it's been a very moving experience and saddening to me sitting around the table with my very young cast for the Revival of Angels. I'm even older than the wonderful actor who's playing Roy Cohn. I'm trying to give them a sense of the terrible time in which the play is set in New York City in the mid-'80s, before most of them had been born. What's strange for me is that while that time has grown as remote as times will grow, faded for all its terribleness as all events become, as all events that become part of history must fade, only the present is entirely vivid. I'm aware that we are, of course, doing the play at a time and in a world in which the biological catastrophe of AIDS has lost all regional specificity and become so vast, so familiar, it's almost become invisible. Angels had its first performances 20 years ago. At that point, around 8 million people had AIDS. Now 33 million people have it. The number of people who had perished from AIDS at that point numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Now the list of those AIDS has claimed numbers them in the millions. At that time, the industrialized world was struggling to regain its humanity by ending its nearly decade-long refusal to address itself to the epidemic, to even acknowledge the existence of the epidemic. The efforts of organizations like GMHC were the catalyst for that slow, lamentably incomplete dawning of decency. Now that the epidemic is a global pandemic, now that our world has lived with AIDS for 30 years, it's sort of disappeared, at least from our quotidian consciousness, from our daily lived experience. experience, at least in certain sheltered parts of the world, the small part of the world that can afford to fool itself, that fooling itself is something it can afford. I guess part of the blame for this paradox, the way that as AIDS has proliferated in reality, it has also dwindled in our consciousness, goes to the phenomenon that the great Robert J. Lifton, writing about the plague of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the 50s and 60s, called nuclear numbing. Death is incommensurable with life. Mass death, Holocaust, extinction, these are incommensurable with thought itself. A lived consciousness of widespread destruction of human life is unendurable for all but a few. Surely also shifting demographics can explain the paradox, an old-fashioned indifference to the suffering of others, especially if they're not in your living room. The fact that nearly 70% of people with AIDS now live in sub-Saharan Africa. Their daily invisibility to those of us in the empire of luxury goods is a sign of how decisively our species lost its struggle to attain its own humanity. Evidence that that struggle is ongoing, evidence that there is cause even in these dark times not to despair, is GMHC and organizations like it that have tirelessly fought to assist and protect people with AIDS, to ensure access to drugs, health care, support, and assistance our society ought to recognize as a collective responsibility, but doesn't. And along with that, I would add library funding. Someday, I believe, our society will. Someday, but until then, we all have to be immensely grateful to GMHC. Evidence of the toughness and difficulty of the struggle, of the lives consumed and enkindled, the strategies involved in mobilizing beleaguered and oppressed communities, and developing languages, practices, methods, and models for survival, advancement, and triumph. These are the jewels contained within GMHC's archive, contained within the vast collection of the LGBT initiative, within this immense bank of our national and human social memory, the New York Public Library. So I want to thank everyone here for the work all of you brave and enduring people do, and I urge everyone here to keep supporting that work, to give as much money as we can afford to give, and let's all try to afford liberally, that is to say generously, that is to say unbounded by fear, that is to say with faith in the future, that is to say progressively. I don't know what Angels in America is about, but I've never felt comfortable hearing it described as an AIDS play. It's absolutely about AIDS, and among many other things. If you come, eat first, it's very, very long. But I suppose, in previews, even longer, but it'll get... Trade in those tickets for February. You didn't hear that from me. I suppose if pressed, I might venture this. This is more evidence that I shouldn't go out in public. It's a play about systems, about the interconnectedness of people and things, about what Harper, one of the characters, calls the great net of souls. It's about, or at least it aspires to be, about the exploration of the enormous complexity, interdependency of the relationships which constitute our fast-forward moving lives and fast, perhaps perilously, certainly unstoppably forward-rolling world. It's an attempt, and it seems to me 20 years later still a worthwhile attempt, to connect things as apparently disparate as ecocide, AIDS, love, justice, and the political plague of Reaganism, among other reasons for the purpose of, or in the hope of, situating the biological horror of AIDS in a social and political context. In the spirit of that ambition, I'll conclude by saying three things. Support GMHC and the New York Public Library generously. And thank you, by the way, for doing it as open-handedly and open-heartedly as you've all been doing. That's number one. Number two, keep our libraries, the brains of our very brainy city, open and staffed and acquiring books. Because the point of GMHC is life, but what's life without libraries? And finally, get out the vote for the midterms. Because if the point of GMHC is life, and the point of the New York Public Libraries is to make life worth living, the point of the midterm elections is the point of libraries and of life itself, the future, to continue to build a future for our democracy, our country, and for all humankind. And now I have to go take notes in the dark, a very special skill I've developed, and share with many small nocturnal mammals and insects. Thank you very much for asking me here. Come see my show and more life.